Okay, we're going to learn about China this time. And now that we've seen several different civilizations, we've noticed sort of a pattern going on. I think you'll notice the same pattern with China. That is, once you have the development of agriculture and settled sedentary villages, over time you have certain changes: an increase in population, right? Increase in surplus food, and then slowly the development of things like craft specialization, and then later on hierarchy and what we would call complex societies. So we're going to see how this worked in China. When we look at the map in China, there's different environmental zones. In the north here, it's colder, it's dry, and it's mainly grassland. And it's not a very good area for agriculture. It is a good area for herding animals, and that's exactly what was done. So this is where the Mongolian nomads come from. It's called Mongolia today, but a lot of different ethnic groups lived there in the past who were herders. The Mongols herded horses among some other animals, but horses were their primary animal. In the center of China, you had the Yellow and Yangtze rivers. Now you can see the area is a lot like the Indus in Mesopotamia. It's low, flat, and it's alluvial, right? That is, you have these major rivers running through that area that are excellent for agriculture. And so this, not surprisingly, is the area of China that we see the first complex societies and the first states emerging, right? This was a good agricultural area. The rivers also, as we saw in other civilizations, provided transportation, trade, and communication between different parts of the society. And then in the southern part of China, and then the sort of the border of Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, Burma, right? This region over here. This is jungle vegetation, weather, more tropical. You also have the development of complex societies a little bit later on after China. We're going to hear about the ancient society of Angkor Wat, or the Khmer Empire, with a presentation we'll have the last week of class. So let's look at the beginning in China. Well, we'll start with the Neolithic. So the Neolithic is when you have agriculture. People settled along the Yellow River. Because of the river, there was a lot of communication and a lot of trade between the different societies along the Yellow River. As a result, the pottery and the architecture in these different sites emerged together in a very similar pattern. You don't have sort of cultures veering off in different directions. It's sort of one regional culture, which is why this period is called the regional Neolithic period, right? Because you in fact have kind of a sort of homogeneous culture all along this territory. They're sort of emerging together. The sites are emerging together. An example of a site from this period is Bampo. We won't go into too much detail, but we'll just sort of see what life was like in the Neolithic in China at this time. It was a small village, a little bit like some of the villages we saw in other parts of the world. People lived in what are called pit houses. That is, the houses were slightly dug in, and then walls on the roof erected around. Some of the houses were sort of smaller and round. Some of the houses were larger and square-shaped. Archaeologists found pottery and hearths and storage facilities in these houses on the floors. You can see the only thing that survived archaeologically are the floors. Nothing of the structure was left, but that was enough to identify the pottery. You can see very well-made, handmade pottery with geometric decorations on it. People were subsisting on agriculture, obviously, at this point. So you had millet, which is a kind of grain. They also had rice. And as we're going to see, another important part of their agricultural system were pigs, right? Domesticated pigs, right? So once you had the regional Neolithic, societies got larger, villages got bigger. At a certain point, archaeologists draw kind of a dividing line with the next period, and this is the Long Shan period. And this is the period of chiefdoms, right? So this is where we first see chiefdoms in China. And we've talked about chiefdoms before and how we could tell that a chiefdom society existed at a certain point, or that a certain society we're studying was a chiefdom rather than a tribe. Well, we're going to look at the Longshan and see the different pieces of evidence that tell us that it was a chiefdom. Right? So we looked at different chiefdoms like the Olmec, we looked at the Ubaid period in Mesopotamia, etc. Typical things with chiefdoms are pieces of evidence is that you have a site hierarchy. You have larger villages and you have smaller villages. And the larger villages is usually where the elites or the people who have more power and wealth will live. You'll have monumental architecture. You'll have the existence of craft specialization. You will have wealth differences that usually show up in burials. And you also have a system of belief and ideology that supports the leadership. Now, all of these things exist in the Longshan period. What you see here is one of the oracle bones that we talked about early on when we were looking at writing in ancient China. And we're going to examine this more in the next period. But we can see that these oracle bones exist even before the state, during the rise of chiefdoms in China. These oracle bones were used by leaders to communicate with ancestors to foretell the future. This gave these leaders special power, special ability, and special status in the society. And because these show up during the Longshan period, we can then state that ideology of leadership that supported leadership in China was already in place before the state during the period when chiefdoms were developing. We also have these really finely made ceramic vessels. All of these took a lot of skill to make. They obviously had to be made by craft specialists. This is, you can see, a drinking vessel with sort of three legs. This is a very thinly walled, goblet-shaped drinking vessel. Now, people have sort of asked, well, in what context are you going to use these kinds of objects? Well, they're really, really finely made drinking vessels, so they were probably used in the context of feasts, and probably feasts for elites or the nobility or the leaders, right? So again, this sort of fits into that the evidence of status and hierarchy within the society, that the elites are probably having feasts, that where these are probably rituals and also celebrations, we think. They're using finely made prestige goods. Remember, we talked about prestige goods, and all the societies we've looked at have had some sort of prestige goods. The first time we mentioned prestige goods was mentioning feathered cloaks in Hawaii. Well, here's another example of a prestige good. These set apart the nobles from the rest of the society. You can see some other examples of these drinking vessels. Also, you have walls made out of earth being built around the villages. These monuments, again, show that there was organization and labor. Those are really the two main ingredients that go into any monumental architecture. That someone is able to call up a workforce, organize them, pay them, right? Motivate them in order to build these constructions. So that's another good marker for a complex society or a chiefdom. Now, this also suggests that there was warfare at the time. It looks like they were trying to protect the village from, let's say, an outsider. So war may have had some sort of influence in the emergence of chiefdoms in China, a little bit like what we saw with Egypt. In pre-dynastic Egypt, you also had warfare, and it probably played a role in what was going on. You have differences in wealth, right? So some graves have quite a lot of wealth, and most graves are very, very simple with only a few pots. You can see this grave has one one person in it, but very, very wealthy. Lots of artifacts. Another way that status was marked in graves was not just burial of artifacts, but also burial of pigs. It looks like pigs were a wealth item. And so sacrificing and burying pigs within a grave was another way that people marked status. People took their wealth with them, but it's because only a few people had a lot of these pigs in their graves. It shows that there was a difference between the top and the bottom. Here's another example of some of the you can see the finely made goods. These are made out of jade, right? Some of them are axes. These are not meant to be used as axes, but the shape is symbolic, so that's very important as well. So during the Longshan, these villages got larger and larger and larger. The larger villages eventually became cities. Some of them became cities. And in the next period, we really see the beginnings of states or civilization, right? So larger complex societies. And this is a period called the Shang Period, right? So during the Shang civilization, right, and here you can see the Yellow River. Right, here's the Yangtze River over here. Right, it's this area where you have the complex societies developing. During the Shang period, you have the development of different cities. These cities were competitive with each other. They were city-states. So it's a little bit like the Maya, where in the Maya civilization, also the Moche civilization, you had independent city-states that were competitive and warlike with each other. One of the cities that we're going to focus on to learn about the Shang is a site called Anyang. At Anyang, they found a palace, and so that indicates that the king and queen had a great deal of power at this time, and that you had a king and queen that wasn't priests or associated with a temple who were ruling the society, but looks like a king and a queen. And within the palace, archaeologists found a number of the oracle bones. And we're going to look at some oracle bones and what was written on a few of them to get an idea of the sort of things that kings would ask their ancestors. Right? But you might recognize some of the different characters. I'll point out some of the characters as we go on. But this is on the scapula. This is on the tortoise shell. You can see some more tortoise shells here. The way that they found them, these were organized in one collection area, right? So it's almost like a little library within the palace. And you can see most of these are tortoise shells. On one side, you have the writing, and on the other side, you have the burn marks from the needle. This is what the king would use to create cracks on the bone, and then he would interpret those cracks to figure out what the ancestors were trying to tell him. One common symbol that you'll see is this sort of, almost looks like a triangular infinity symbol. Right? It's supposed to represent a bronze cauldron, and it indicates divinity. We're going to talk about bronze in the Shang civilization. Bronze was very, very important. The Shang considered it more important than even gold. And cauldrons that were made out of bronze were dedicated as gifts to ancestors. And so the picture of a cauldron indicates divine, right? Indicates a spirit or a god. Okay? Within Anyang, they also found human sacrifices, as you can see here. But one of the most important things that they found at Anyang were royal tombs. Now, you can see here that some of the earliest archaeologists to work at Anyang were Chinese archaeologists themselves, so not Europeans or people from Western Europe, but actually Chinese scholars who learned archaeology and excavated these sites. So that's sort of interesting. There were 11 royal tombs found at Anyang. Which was interesting to Chinese scholars for a number of reasons, as we're going to see. But one of the reasons was in later writing in China, the Shang period is described as this very, very remote early period that had 11 rulers. And later Chinese historians thought that these rulers were probably mythical because it was so long ago, the history couldn't be correct. But when they found these 11 tombs, they realized that probably the history was correct, and that those 11 rulers are related to real rulers who existed during the Shang period. This is a pretty typical Shang royal burial. So this was for a king, and the king would be placed here in the middle. All around the king were human sacrifices, right? So sacrificial victims. So this should remind you a little bit of the royal tomb of Sipan in the Moche civilization, or the royal tombs of Ur that we saw in Mesopotamia, right? So there were ramps leading down, as you can see, to a large pit. The king was buried there along with retinue and other people who were sacrificed there and then buried, along with all sorts of artifacts. All of the king's tombs were looted later on, so there are things that were found there, but not most of the artifacts that would have been buried with the king. But as we're going to see, those artifacts, those kinds of artifacts, were found in the royal tomb, but that was a royal tomb of a queen that was never looted. So, and that was a very important find, as you'll see. So this is maybe what the burial of a king during the Shang period might have looked like. In one of the Shang royal burials, you can see a chariot was buried with the king. The chariots were the most important weapon during this time. You can see the horses here were buried with the ruler, the bridle of the horses, the remnants of the chariot, and the chariot driver. Right? These chariots were very important because they allowed people to be mobile on the battlefield. And we said that war was a very important aspect of Shang civilization at this point. So the Shang used their bronze technology to make weapons and armor. This is the kind of helmet that they would have worn into battle, and this huge, enormous axe that has this kind of anthropomorphic design on it that certainly is very fearsome, and you can see these kinds of spears that would have been used. Well, a queen whose tomb was found, whose name was Fu Hao, was very important in the military of Anyang. She was the favorite queen of the king. His name was Wu Ding, but she was also the general of the army, and she won a number of battles for the king. And it shows how in some civilizations women could attain very high positions of power, and in some civilizations they had less of an opportunity to do so. Egypt and China are good examples of civilizations where women and queens could attain very large amounts of power. Well, archaeologists found the tomb of Fu Hao, who was the queen of Wu Ding. She was buried in the center here. This was a very important burial. It had over 1,600 different items, and also 7,000 cowrie shells from the ocean, which served as a bed or a litter for the body of Queen Fu Hao. There were over 400 bronzes, 590 jade pieces, 560 bone objects, 70 stone objects. You won't have to remember all those numbers, but you realize it was very, very wealthy, and sacrificial burials as well. So some of her servants were buried with her. Here you can see what looked like during the excavation of the tomb, and this is the position where they would have found Fu Hao and some of her servants, and you can see the important bronzes over here. And at the site is a statue of Fu Hao. Right? So she's sort of one of these important female warriors within Chinese history. What about writing? Well, what does the writing tell us about what was going on in the Shang period? Well, the writing again is written on these oracle bones. Here you can again see the symbol for a bronze cauldron, which indicates divinity. This is the symbol, I believe, for rain. It's sort of turned the other way. The king would write down a question, would create cracks. Here's that cauldron symbol again. Create cracks by using a bronze needle. Interpret the cracks. Write down what the ancestors told him. Then after the event, would write down what happened. So we have a kind of an idea of what the king is concerned with, what's going on during the Shang period, and actually what happened. So, So let's take a a look at one of these oracle bones. In this one, the king, Wu Ding, wants to know if Fu Hao's childbearing will be good. He wants to know if he will have a male heir. He read the cracks and wrote. The king, reading the cracks, said, if it be a Ting Day childbearing, which is a day of the week, it will be good. If it be a Kang Day childbearing, it will be extremely auspicious. Right? So these are days of the week. So that is the prediction, the prognostication. Verification, the 31st day she gave birth, it was not good. It was a girl. The baby was born on the Chia day. So the prophecy was correct. So you could see the prophecy has some ambiguity, and it's typically these prophecies do have some ambiguity where there's interpretation involved, where it'd be if this happens, it's a good sign. If this happens, it's a bad sign. Not always yes and no. All right, let's look at another example. This one is a little bit hard to understand at first, but let's look at it. Okay, one of the enemies of the Shang were another group called the Fang. Right? The ancestor, one of the important ancestors of the Shang, was an ancestor named Di. Right? What the Shang rulers are trying to learn is, are our enemies harming and attacking us because our ancestor is using them to punish us, right? Because this is important to know, because if the ancestor is using the enemy to punish you, and you try and fight this enemy, you're also going against your ancestor. You did something wrong and your ancestor is punishing you. Your ancestor won't be on your side in that battle. And so you need to make things good with the ancestor or spirit before you fight your enemy. If, however, the Fang are doing this on their own and not because your ancestor is causing them to attack you, then you could attack them knowing that your ancestor's behind you. Right? So because the Fang are harming and attacking us, we will raise men. It is not Di who orders the Fang to make disaster for us. So they learned, it is not our ancestor who is behind this, therefore we can go and attack our enemy. This kind of prognostication before a battle or a war is very typical for this ancient time period. You see it in many different cultures, including, I should point out, the Bible. If you read, the book of Samuel and book of Joshua, there are many cases where, for example, in the book of Samuel, King David will go to the high priest and ask, should we attack so-and-so? Let's say, for example, the Philistines. And the priest will consult an oracle and say, yes, because Yahweh or God says that he will deliver the enemy to you. Right? So it's a very, very similar kind of concept that you see in many different cultures. And you can see how the writing system, like we've talked about before, changes over time. Right there, you can see that cauldron, right, which in this case, in the Shan case, represents Ding, or that ancestor spirit. You can see rain. We looked at a couple of these already. These might look familiar to you, they might not, right? But what is being shown here is something that we have already seen in other cultures. We saw it with Shavin, we saw it with the Olmec, we saw it with other cultures. These are part animal, part human figures that usually indicate some sort of transformation from a human into an animal spirit. And usually this is in the context of trance or shamanism. And so just like the Maya, and just like the Olmec, Chinese kings had these kind of shamanic properties to them, right? So they sort of had supernatural powers. They could communicate directly with spirits. And when you think about other cultures where the kings are communicating with ancestral kings, another example would be the Maya. The Maya let their blood in order to communicate with their ancestors. Here, the kings are using writing to communicate with their ancestors. So we see similarities between different cultures that are separated throughout the world. They develop similar things. And some of these things might emerge from the fact that shamanism existed in all of these cultures originally. Right? So kings sort of using their role as shamans to sort of increase their own power. The Shang bronzes are very complex. They're very, very well made. It was really the height of metallurgy at the time. They were used not only for weapons like we saw before, but also for feasting and for gifts, right? So cauldrons like this were given as gifts to ancestors, but they're also used in the context of feasts. So cauldrons like this where they held food. You can see a little bit how these cauldrons might have been produced. It was a complex process. Right? Here you can see some other cauldrons. Here are some drinking vessels, right? They would have drunk some sort of rice-based alcohol in these drinking vessels. And you can see the different kinds of bronzes. The largest bronze ever found from an ancient culture is found from the Shang period. It's one piece, and it's the size of a VW bug car. So enormous, and shows really the complex metallurgy that occurred. Later history reports that the Shang elites and rulers were kind of hedonists. They liked alcohol, they liked drinking, they liked partying, and sort of blame this as the sort of the cause for the fall of the Shang dynasty, or the Shang civilization. What recent researchers have done is to actually examine some of these bronzes that they use for feasts, and what they found is that these bronzes contained a pretty high amount of lead that was used in producing the bronze. Now, they did tests where they replicated these bronze vessels using the same technology with the same lead content. They poured rice wine in there, and after a few minutes they found that lead leached into the rice wine, and so anyone who used it for these feasts would have ingested lead as well as the rice alcohol. And lead is a neurotoxin that will cause strange behavior and then death, and so maybe the strange behavior that is later reported by Chinese historians may actually have been recollecting the lead poisoning that was occurring among the elites at this time. That's one hypothesis, right? But the Shang did fall, right? They did kind of collapse, but that wasn't obviously the end of China. When states emerged again, the states were even larger than before, right? So overall, the trend that we see in many different societies is an upward trend from small societies to larger societies. So we're going to stop the video at this point, and in the next video, we're going to look at this next phase called the Warring States period, and also the first empire of China. So you guys stay safe and have a good day.